everybody. I'm Melissa Korf. I'm the Director of Grants and Contracts at Harvard Medical School and the newly minted co-chair of the Research Compliance Committee. So thanks so much for joining us today. Hopefully this means you love compliance as much as I do, or are as interested in the reduction of administrative burden of research compliance as I am. Since I'm a new co-chair to the committee, and conveniently it's a brand new phase with new perspectives and new members, I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to take a little bit of a step back and to think through a gap analysis of, you know, do we have the right subcommittees? Do we have the right working groups? Are there major research compliance pain points that we're missing, or opportunities for us to help reduce burden in the research compliance space that we need to make sure that we're adding to our list of priorities? So at the end of today's session, I'm hoping that we'll leave with a good sense of sort of what our top 10 priorities would be for this phase right now, and maybe a little bit of a roadmap for how we'll tackle some of those. Oh, I got a little quick happy here. Sorry about that. So in terms of just a little bit of a plan for the session today, I thought we could talk a little bit about some of the background of the Research Compliance Committee and the structure here, although I'll try not to replicate too much the committee update that we gave during Monday's committee update session, and then walk through some of the research compliance focused highlights from the 2018 Faculty Workload Survey Report. And from there, discuss both next steps that seem natural based on the data we have from the Faculty Workload Survey, or areas that we should be covering based on some of your own experiences. So just to recap what the Research Compliance Committee goals are: to review existing and new administrative requirements imposed both by federal regulations or program officers related to research compliance, with an emphasis on harmonization of requirements across federal agencies, reduction of redundancies, and identification of good practices. We want to make sure that we're not compromising compliance or, you know, the ethical conduct of research, but we're reducing unnecessary burden that doesn't help us ensure that, and just adds burden to the process. This includes, but is not limited to, human subjects protections, animal care and use, conflict of interest, export controls, and data stewardship. I wonder a little bit if this is still true now that ERI is a formal programmatic committee, but research compliance is one of the youngest, if not the youngest, of the FDP programmatic committees, and was formed in the grand scheme of the FDP not that long ago as a response to some of the issues that were identified in one of the early faculty workload surveys. As you'll see when we get into the faculty workload survey data, research compliance topics and areas really focus very heavily in some of the pain points for our faculty that are engaged in those areas. I think as Sandy has said, you know, one of the #1 ways to reduce your burden associated with research is not to do animal research, not to do human subjects research, you know, not to do all of these things that have these compliance requirements. And data stewardship is our youngest subcommittee, approved back in May of 2015, which in the grand scheme of the FDP, you know, our subcommittees tend to be pretty stable, but it has been a while then since we've really taken on a new focus area. And so a great opportunity for us to take a step back and make sure that we're covering all of the appropriate topics, or if we're leaving anything untouched that could help reduce burden. So a little recap of the current committee structure. Diane Dean from NIH and I are the co-chairs of the Research Compliance Committee broadly. Ara Tomasian and Axel Wolf co-chair the Animal Care and Use Committee for us, subcommittee for us. Mary Lee and Diane Dean co-chair the Conflict of Interest subcommittee. Both co-chair positions for data stewardship are currently vacant. Doug Backman co-chairs export controls with one of the co-chair positions currently vacant. And Deb Murphy co-chairs human subjects with one of the co-chair positions currently vacant. So we're a committee in transition with a lot of opportunities to invent ourselves to meet the most pressing priorities. The full report, if you're interested, is from the most recent faculty workload survey, is available. It's linked still from the FGP main site, the fgp.org, but I've also included a link directly to the report if you're interested. And in addition to being asked if respondents being asked if they experienced a set of compliance responsibilities, if they indicated that they experienced that responsibility, they were also asked to indicate whether that responsibility represented a substantial workload or whether responsibility was a low, medium, or high priority for change to reduce administrative burden. So this was, I think it's aimed at trying to help us understand where faculty felt that the burden might be right-sized to the complexity or regulatory requirements related to a responsibility. So if, for example, we'd done it absolutely as much as we could to reduce the administrative burden associated with human subjects protections, and what remained was really what was absolutely necessary to protect those human subjects, we might anticipate that that would be ranked low. Whereas if there's really a disconnect between what's really needed for compliant or ethical research and the requirements that we're imposing, if they're really mismatched, then the burden feels higher than it should be. We might expect that to be highly ranked. So I'm going to try to pause as we get to sort of get through each major theme in looking at some of these results for any questions or comments or people who want to chime in. And we're also going to have an opportunity for discussion. So I just wanted to remind folks to feel free to go ahead and put any thoughts that you have or questions or suggestions into the chat, or like Lily mentioned early on, if you go into the participant list, you can raise your hand if you'd like to speak. So in terms of looking at compliance requirements, and you can see that these are the overarching compliance requirements that were included in that section of the survey: COI, responsible conduct of research, IRB human subjects, HIPAA, IACUC animal subjects, and clinical trials. The prevalence of compliance requirements, where we see the most number of people that are experiencing that responsibility, is within conflict of interest and responsible conduct of research. And that's not surprising, because these are requirements that are by and large imposed regardless of the type of research that's being conducted. So, NIH would require certain COI compliance requirements for all of their awards, regardless of what it is that you're doing. And so is the same, I think, with responsible conduct of research. And then we see the prevalence drop off a little bit with the smallest prevalence in clinical trials. In terms of substantial workload, if we go back to the previous slide, we see that IACUC falls sort of lowest, or second to lowest on the list of prevalence and requirements. But when we get to substantial workload, IACUC falls pretty prominently at the top in a substantial workload. There does appear to be a slight reduction in responses here in 2018 from 2012, but it still factors pretty high on the workload. It's followed by clinical trials and human subjects research. So even though we see that COI is highly prevalent in terms of people having to deal with that, it doesn't, sort of a flipped pyramid a little bit, it doesn't factor as high in terms of the substantial workload requirements. And I think mirroring a little bit that last table is the highest priority for change, where we see that the most number of people who are experiencing IACUC in animal subjects, the most of those people have said that it's a high priority for change. It remains a high priority for change. Similarly with clinical trials. And then the other areas kind of taper off a little bit. We didn't necessarily ask breakout questions for every one of the topics, but I've been trying to include a little bit more information on some of the detailed components of these responsibilities where it was available in the report. And so this again is where, where a respondent experienced the IACUC responsibility and ranked it as high or highest priority for change, we then asked some follow-up questions to try to get a little bit more detail on what specifically was leading to that response. Factoring highest here is the 3-year rewrite of IACUC protocols, followed by protocol for initial IACUC review. And I hope that our CUSP project might be one that is targeted at maybe making some movement in this protocol for initial IACUC review space. So it's seeing that is factoring really high on respondents' priorities for improvements in IACUC. I think it really reinforces how important that project is for reducing burden in this space. And we can gain, some more information as well from some of the other topics if there are, maybe some things we would want to tackle related to minor changes to protocols, or looking at some of the IACUC software forms and seeing if consistency across those might be able to help reduce burden. For IRB human subjects, so again, for those respondents that had ranked IRB human subjects as a high priority or highest priority for change, we're asked to kind of drill down into that a little bit further. And here we see fit of IRB processes to type of research and level of risk as a pretty high priority, along with turnaround time of IRB application revisions and protocols for initial IRB review. And so I wonder if maybe there's something that we want to look at in that space as well. We do have the IRB wizard, which is hopefully a tool that would help reduce the burden associated with review and approval of expedited research, but maybe there are some other activities that would help in these spaces that we should consider. COI responsibilities, which if you remember the slides before, COI is really high prevalence where a lot of investigators experience that responsibility, but it did appear lowest on the table of highest priorities for change. And we see here that the level of detail required in COI reports factors pretty heavily as a high priority for change to reduce burden. Although I wonder in the foreign influence kind of regulatory landscape that we're in right now, we might be finding ourselves getting worse in that space before we could hope to get better. So I just want to pause there for 1 second and see if there are any thoughts that anyone wants to offer or suggestions. Anyone see anything in this feedback that makes you think of a project you wish FDP would take on?
As a reminder, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So you can either put them in the chat box or raise your hand in the participants list and we can call on you.
think Alex is physically raising her hand.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks for unmuting me. I just wanted to remind everybody that, so for people who are new to the committee, I'm Alex Alvanack. I'm the co-chair of FDP and the former co-chair of Research Compliance. So just a reminder, one thing that we talked about back in May of 2019, we had a mini retreat, and at that point, we just got preliminary results from the faculty survey. And I think most of the consensus was that we should really dig deep into what we're finding. And thanks, Melissa, for actually, highlighting that essentially it's the same issues that we've had, only a little bit differently. I'd like to, give a shout out to our Animal Care and Use Subcommittee. They have been an extremely active and effective subcommittee. And I'd like to think that some of the regulatory changes and some of the policy changes and procedure changes within institutions even have actually helped to reduce that level. Even though it's still very prevalent, it's gotten a little better. And I'd like to think that that's like a really good example of where FDP has been effective in working together with our federal partners. So thanks, Axel. Thanks, Ara. The second thing that I just wanted to bring up is that we did have, I'll make sure the notes are posted. I don't know why they're not on the website, but the website's out to date, but we can fix that. A lot of people have brought up, they think we should have a few additional subcommittees, or you should have, sorry, I'm still in the research compliance mode. One of them came up was biosafety. I think that's something that I'd love to hear. We'd love to hear more from our faculty side, because it's definitely, I think, more a faculty focused compliance issue. So biosafety, we also talked about foreign influence, which obviously is, we just had a session on that, and I think we have a robust response. And then data management plans, which Melissa, you just talked about in the last two sessions you've been in, that, this is going to be a hot topic for sure. So I think research rigor and responsibility was another one. So I'm just bringing them up to kind of help start the discussion. It looks like we've got lots of comments. So I can mute myself and see if that jogs some people.
Yeah, so we have some great.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Oh, sorry. So thanks so much for that, Alex. I paused after we got through the sort of research compliance themes, because things like biosafety, lab safety were included in safety and security. So there's different figures there. And then it becomes a little bit harder to kind of compare them. But we do see that biosafety, and it's increasing in 2018 versus 2012, does factor pretty high on the list of where there's substantial workload in the safety security space.
So it looks like we've got some good comments going on in the chat. One person says it would be good to tackle foreign influence in the COI disclosures, and a number of people agreed with that.
So we do have representation from our COI group that are participating on the Foreign Influence Working Group that's being led by Jim Luther and Pamela Webb. But I think it would be interesting to understand if there's offshoot projects that it would be helpful to take on in this space. We can bring that back to the FIG. The W is silent, I guess, as Pamela says, to FIG. And see if it fits within their scope, or consider, standing up a separate working group if that becomes necessary. So in terms of conflict of commitment, we do have a separate working group that's just kicking off on that. That's, many thanks to Amanda Humphrey and Alice Young, who have agreed to try to help tackle that sticky wicket for us. And so we can make sure that folks have access to their contact information if anyone is interested in participating in that working group.
We have one comment that they'd love to see more faculty co-chairs on more of the subcommittees. And then someone asked, whom should the faculty contact to serve as co-chairs?
I guess that's me. But also, I think maybe to make sure that you're staying connected with Michelle Masucci and Robert Nobles. I know that they've been working very hard with the faculty committee and with and will be working very hard with the nominating committee and the executive committee to make sure that we're making sure to have faculty involvement without burning out our amazing faculty representatives. So we want to be making sure that we're keeping the faculty perspective at the forefront on some of these topics, but being mindful that that those representatives can become a little stretched thin when every subcommittee wants one of them to be co-chairs with us. So
we have another comment that there's substantial admin burden on the animal care and use side in terms of DoD grants. They're not sure if we have anyone addressing that currently.
I think that's a great point. I wonder if someone could, I don't see, I'm trying to scroll through some of the comments. I don't see that one. Is it specifically in relation to the re-review, the command re-review of IACRIC protocols?
She says yes.
Yes. I don't believe it's something that we're working on right now. DoD is a little tricky because we do have some of the DoD components that are involved, but that are members of the FGP, but not all of them. But I think that's definitely a great topic for us to take a look at. I believe there's still a requirement for command review of human subjects protocols as well.
We have a question. Any attendees complete the recent NIH COI survey that was defined as optional in the NIH email that had an email stalking component, meaning they sent numerous requests to complete the survey? Was this optional in any sense about how the data are used, if perhaps this was done by NIH previously?
So I think that's referring to the OIG survey. That was a little bit broader than just COI. It was faculty disclosures. Numerous requests. Yeah, I think at my institution, at least, we have 3 separate DUNS numbers, and therefore we received 3 separate requests to complete the survey. So it's possible that if they didn't know one email address to reach out to, or if it was a situation where you similarly had multiple DUNS, I don't believe we received any email stalking on that one. And we were working on a response. I don't know if there's anyone else that would want to comment. And we don't really have a representative from NIH here, so I hesitate to comment on how they're going to use the data.
We do have a comment that she's correct that it was a voluntary mandated response. And someone else agreed that they were contacted several times until they filed a response.
Yeah, and I see some comments now too saying no one really seems to know how OIG plans to use the responses. And I do think that they would, I believe that COGR has been interfacing a great deal with HHS on I think some slight modifications to the questions, and then just sort of a better understanding of how OIG intends to use the data. I do think it was optional. I heard from some colleague institutions that were considering not submitting a response. But at the same time, you know, when there are these types of information requests, we are in a little bit of a catch-22, and I think that's, you know, the case with a lot of different compliance things. It's hard to ask the question that you really need an answer to without feeling like you're letting the cat out of the bag, so to speak, on your institutional practices, and that it leads to probably some of the institutionally imposed burden we see in some of these spaces where a fear that we aren't doing enough leads us to do too much.
So we have a comment, faculty attendee here. Institutional IACUCs themselves can impose a lot of burden. Can CUSP talk about the best way to engage our own IACUC members and staff in the processes being developed?
I don't know if Axel might be here, but I think that's a great point, is to think through. We had some information sharing at some point about, I think it was an IACUC Institute or something like that, opportunities for training of IACUCs or conversations with IACUCs that tried to make it a little bit more of a safe space, that they could learn more about exactly what it is that they need to do to enable compliance, but without going kind of too overboard. So I think that that's a great topic for maybe us to take back to Axel and Ara and reinvigorate some of that information sharing on opportunities to do that. So I think that that is a topic that has been at least discussed in the past, and we can see what resources we have.
Comments for now. I believe if anyone has anything else they'd like to add, feel free to raise your hand or add into the chat box. Oh, we have one. What is the status of the IRB wizard? Can it be accessed? We
are currently trying to develop a sustainability plan for the IRB wizard in terms of where we'll post it and what support can be provided to institutions who wish to download the tool. So stay tuned on that one. We hope to have a little bit more of a substantial update on where and how it can be accessed by institutions in a little bit. Hopefully, ideally by the May meeting, if not sooner. So just to go over a little bit more of the faculty workload survey content. Sorry, getting a little trigger happy here. So data management appeared under research administration rather than along with the research compliance topics. And in relation to things like project personnel or project finances, data management did fall a little bit lower than those items in terms of substantial workload, but we can see that in comparison to 2012, the workload associated with data management appears to have increased substantially. And I imagine if we did this same survey and asked sort of the same questions in a few more years, we might see that increase even further with the continuing prevalence of policies like the new NIH policy. And then when we move over in terms of high priority for change, data management pretty much in that same second to lowest spot, but still there is a high priority for change there for some respondents. Development of data management plans, as well as identifying appropriate external data repositories and institutional resources for data sharing, factor pretty high in terms of priority for reduction of burden. So, one potential suggestion we've had is, could we do a cusp for data management plans? There already is a great tool out there with data management templates, DMP tool, but perhaps this could be actually creating standardized template language rather than DMP tool, which just provides a template. So we could say, if you're going to use the dbGaP repository to satisfy your sharing obligation, then your data management plan can include this text, and that, really well describes that. I think that NIH is really, with some of the supplemental information, they're trying to address the issue of repositories, but it does sometimes feel like we need a repository of repositories to help identify the right place to house some data. And then I think that, in particular, in relation to how exactly it is we're going to pay for it, sort of the institutional resources to support data sharing and data management best practices definitely is a topic area for data stewardship right now. And we're looking at a collaboration with finance, audit, and costing in terms of how we might mitigate the cost to institutions, but provide the resources that are necessary to support this. So I think I'll just go through the safety and security requirements really quick, and then we'll talk about a few more comments. So please do go ahead and raise your hand or add a comment if you want to share it when we're through these slides. So like I mentioned before, safety and security is a separate section in the faculty workload survey. So if you look at just the compliance sections and you're like, I don't see export controls, it's because it's in the safety and security section. So general laboratory safety, it is the highest prevalence of these responsibilities. And we did at one point, actually, I think it was Robert Nobles and Alice Young that had helped co-chair a working group on lab safety. I think it was around the time that there were some extremely unfortunate accidents that raised the profile of the need for good lab safety practices. And of course, we have an export controls subcommittee, but we really don't have anything that tackles the more general biosafety topics. And it's possible that some of these things like lab access controls, radiation safety, controlled substances could fall under that biosafety, or perhaps we would call it EH&S type of theme. And biosafety factors very high here in substantial workload, and we see that it's increased in 2018 versus 2012. As with controlled substances, narcotics, chemical safety, general lab safety has increased a little bit, but not as much as some of those other topics. And then we see here in terms of high priority for change, export controls. I shudder a bit to think, based on my own experience with our export control compliance program at my institution, what the responses on that would look like were the survey to be run today. With everything that's going on with the foreign influence and focus in that space, it seems as if our focus on our export control compliance program has had to increase correspondingly. And then biosafety and some of the related topics factor in pretty heavily as well, kind of going along with supporting the notion that perhaps we would want to consider some sort of a biosafety subcommittee to complement some of our other committees. Just a really quick look at some of the responsibility components. And I guess I should say, we didn't necessarily ask those drill down questions on every one of the topics. It would have become a really unmanageable survey if we had done that. So there isn't an opportunity for us to drill down a little bit further into the data in terms of what exactly in export controls is causing some of this burden. But it is a high profile or a high priority item. And then in terms of responsibility components, that at least 50% of those asked. So I think a respondent had to say that they experienced that responsibility to be asked whether or not it was a high priority for change. These are some of the components that were referenced by at least 50% of those asks. So within IRB human subjects, it's the fit of the process to the risk level and turnaround time that seem to be the highest priority. IACUC animal subjects, pretty consistent with what we saw before. Conflict of interest, and then I included the note here for intellectual property and material transfer agreements as being a high priority because in my experience at my institution, that similarly goes hand in hand with some of the export control reviews and some of the focus on protecting intellectual property, you know, with the focus on foreign influence. All right, so these are some of the questions I had for just a general discussion, and it does look like we might have had some comments in the chat box, Lily.
Yeah, so to follow up on the IRB comment, can it be accessed so we can start evaluating it internally?
Let me check on that with David and Deb. I don't know if Deb has joined that, Deb Murphy, who's the co-chair of IRB. But we will make sure that we follow up after the session and share information on whether that can be accessed at this time or when we anticipate being able to post it.
Okay. OLA and USDA have been very willing to engage in conversation regarding minimizing burden and have done an excellent job of developing and disseminating guidance. What I see from the individual level is a combination of inertia, we've always done it this way, and it will confuse everyone if we change, and fear that there are going to be gotcha findings during AAALAC site visits due to the opinion of individual site visitors.
I feel like I want to read that one.
It's Cindy Rosenblatt. Maybe Cindy, do you want to raise your hand and we can discuss this? Cindy.
Hi, Cindy.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I was trying to find the raising hand thing and I couldn't look at it. So the federal agencies I have been very impressed with their efforts towards burden reduction in the past couple, 2-3 years. And they have done a great job of developing guidance, of disseminating it to their user base. There are a lot of things on their agenda that haven't quite been accomplished yet, but they're working on it. We have 2 great projects going on at FDP right now that will also address some of these issues. All of that is out there already. A lot of people have been putting a lot of work into making this move forward and happen. I still get regular calls from peers. So I'm the IACUC program manager at my institution. I get calls and have discussions from people across the country at all different types of institutions. And often what I'm hearing is the reason they aren't changing things is because it's a lot of work to change something and to educate your user base about what the new process is. And even if it's better, there's a lot of resistance to making changes that aren't mandated from certain subsets of particularly our faculty members. And I totally get that. They are overwhelmed and they don't want to, I get that. At the same time, there is concern that anything we change, so ALAC International is our accrediting agency for the animal programs. and we have mandatory site visits every 3 years. They are not they're not a regulatory agent exactly, but we all pretty much try to be and remain ALAC accredited because it makes funding, receiving funding from a lot of places much easier. And anything that ALAC says ends up sort of having the force of regulation. I mean, you can push back against site findings, and sometimes you're successful in that, and sometimes they put their foot down. But a lot of people are afraid to make changes even when they've been supported by the federal agencies because they're not sure what ALAC is going to think about it. And the one example I gave, so a lot of institutions, my own included, have mandatory full committee review categories. So certain projects, certain protocols that come in automatically get shifted to this track where they have to wait for a full committee meeting, for discussion at a full committee, a convened meeting, versus just going ahead and moving into the designated member review process, which tends to be a quicker way to move protocols through the system. I have heard from multiple people at my own institution and other institutions that ALAC would consider that a deficiency in our program if we didn't have certain categories of more high profile projects that automatically underwent full committee review. And so some of these things might be helpful if ALAC International would also address the reduction in burden efforts that the federal agencies are making to reassure their member institutions that this is acceptable and that they're going to get a consistent response when their site visitors come to visit.
It sounds a little bit like a struggle we have on the sort of more general administrative side of the research administration house, where we live in fear of what the auditor will say, even if we're pretty confident that uniform guidance says we could do X, but what will the auditor say? And in that space, I think it's often come up that, wouldn't it be helpful then to include the audit community in FDP conversations? But then there's a fear, sort of like I said, in terms of the survey or things like that, there's a fear that people will be less open and forthcoming in the conversation if there's auditors in the room, because, how is that going to come back to haunt you? So I wonder what folks would think about the right way to be engaging with the ALAC community in terms of the site visits and how we might tackle that issue.
Awesome. Deborah is on and she has her hand raised. Oh.
Hi, this is Deb. Happy Wednesday, everyone. I'm having trouble with my Zoom, so it won't let me video, but we have our ALAC site visit coming up in March. And when I have a time to talk to the attending veterinarian beforehand, one of us will ask the question, do they have experience with institutions who use DMR for full committee review protocols that are currently reviewed that way? And I'll get back to the group and let you know what they say. We can always have an informal discussion, and that's probably how our vet would prefer that we do it, just because we do rely upon our accreditation for a lot of the good reasons that have already been mentioned. The other thing is we have had a tremendous amount of public records requests in COVID times. I think people have time on their hands, And while we have talked about DMR for full protocol reviews for now, we kind of feel like it would not be available for all species, just because we want to have very good practices for documenting decisions on adverse events or when we have reporting to OLAS. So, I mean, there's some really good programmatic reasons to rely on full committee review. And I know it's time consuming, but sometimes institutions make the decision that they think is best for the investigators as well. So I'd be interested in anybody else's comments.
Okay. So we have another comment on the AAA LACI. Maybe we can contact their committee members. An idea. Oh. Joseph, please.
Yep. Hi, this is J.R. Haywood. You know, I think it's certainly possible to invite ALAC to visit our next meeting. You know, I think the president of ALAC this year is a chair of an IACUC, and you know, he's one of us, so to speak. So I'm not sure we've ever had an accrediting body, so you know, we may want to talk about that. But with regard to designated member review, I fully agree that it may be proportional to the type of research. Certainly Category E protocols need to have a full committee review, but you know, institutions have a lot of latitude to use designated member review, and we have used it for many years at Michigan State University, and we had our site visit just before COVID hit, and things went rather smoothly with respect to the protocol review process. So there's certainly no general attitude with ALAC in terms of dismissing DMR. There may be individual site visitors that have concerns, and those concerns may be related to the type of research at an institution. So a lot of variables when we talk about full committee versus designated member review. Thank you.
We had another comment in the chat. In terms of data management, is there an opportunity related to implementing practices for compliance with new requirements before they become more burdensome?
I certainly think that's what we're hoping to be able to do with some of the data stewardship activities. So, you know, even though we're not looking at an effective date on the policy, the new NIH policy, until January 2023, what can we be doing now to sort of get out ahead of burdensome implementations of that? What can we be doing now to support to support researchers getting ready for compliance with that plan, and support our member institutions in developing their own institutional resources? So I think that's hopefully with that policy, we're in that unique position where we're trying to sort of cut the burden off at the pass. But it does seem like in some of these areas we're at burden central, and so what can we do now to walk some of that back? I think I'd like to pose another, you know, or the sort of the question a little bit of a different way to everyone, and that is sort of, if we were to develop a top 10 list of priorities for this phase, what would that be? Is it, you know, interfacing with ALAC in terms of IACUC? Is it something related to export controls, and looking at, you know, I don't know, reviews of international shipments, or what you know, and feel free to pop it in the chat too. If you have one priority, or a couple priorities that you'd really like to see movement on in research compliance, what would they be? So I know for me, and that's because I'm the data girl, although I have to be a little bit broader. Now that I'm supporting all of research compliance, is to sort of, just as Missy mentioned, try to get out in front of the new NIH policy, and support implementation, while trying to mitigate burden. So I think, you know, that policy is going to have a lot of impact on a lot of researchers who rely on NIH funding, and to the extent that we can mitigate the burden impact, that would be great.
So there's a comment: would the IRB folks think that an accreditation session with AHRPP along with ALAC be a good discussion?
I think, I don't want to speak for Deborah. Do you want to unmute Deborah just in case she wants to comment on that? I don't want to necessarily speak for her, but that could be a nice way to kind of reduce the pressure on either one of them, or you know, any one person or one organization, if we had them both here together. And I see that Sheila has said yes. Mark has said absolutely. So Deborah, what would you think?
I think that'd be fine. We're not a medical school, and we're not accredited for the IRB, but I don't see any harm in inviting. And they always have really good information to share, because we do use many of their practices and all of their checklists and self-audit requirements. So even if you're not pursuing accreditation, they would have valuable information to share, I believe.
All right, JR, I see no dissenting opinions. Can I count on you to help me plan that session? Other thoughts or other priorities, particularly interested in those faculty out there?
Comment, would it be useful to include PRIM and
Primer.
as they influence our staff?
Looking at some of this, I think just a list of acronyms, like maybe that would be pretty solid if we came up with a list of all of these acronyms. Help us speak the same language. I am very appreciative of the person that spelled out DMR for me, since I'm not an IAC person myself. So, I mean, I wonder, I mean, Primer, I think, is a little bit like Ankura, I think. So I wonder what folks would think about including them. All right. I am hearing from Lillian that I thought we had a 90-minute session, but in fact we have a 60-minute session. So we're really close to time. I need you. We need all of the perspectives. So if we didn't get to, I'm certainly going to be taking a look at the chat and some of the great ideas that are in the chat. Harmonizing COI processes, making sure that we focus on the conflict of commitment potentially as a priority. And we need you to share your ideas with us, to send me what, if we haven't talked about your priority, if we haven't talked about the item that is your biggest pain point, let me know. We have also woken up the general research compliance listserv. Up until now, we've had listservs that were really sort of subcommittee or topic focused. And as we're trying to kind of get the overall committee really going and thinking about, what spaces haven't we waded into that maybe FGP could be helpful. Sign up for that research compliance listserv. It's an option now if you go to the mailing list page on the website, you can check off the research compliance listserv and indicate that you'd like to sign up for that one. Send a note to the research compliance listserv if you've got something general, if you've got an idea for something that we should be working on. And importantly, if you'd like to volunteer, please send me a note. Let me know what you're thinking. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for all of these great thoughts.